Okay, so let me introduce our panel, um, which is very diverse in terms of kind of their fields, and I think will make it very interesting. Professor Vance Ricks is a professor of philosophy and computer science, which I think is fascinating. And he's been dealing with a number of issues, including the ethics of AI and kind of where it's heading. Joanna Weiss is the executive director of the AI Literacy Lab, is that right? Which is looking at connections between AI and local journalism, but also more broadly on, where AI is going. Professor John Wibby is a journalism professor and has spent a lot of time looking at the platforms, Facebook and so forth, the comments, how you control them, the impact it's having, and has now increasingly begun looking at AI and its impact not only on journalism but on elections, sort of an example of how AI is beginning to sort of affect everything. We're going to ask you some questions first, and you can talk, and then we'll turn it over to the students. I thought I might start by saying, if you could talk a little bit about your field and where you are. We were asking the students earlier how AI was affecting them and how concerned or unconcerned they were. And I'm wondering, from where you sit and from where you teach and your interactions with industry, where do you see AI having the biggest impact, and what do you see coming for the future, kind of in your areas? Professor Ricks.
Oh, I have to go first. Okay. So should I give some background about myself first?
Sure.
Okay. So thank you for welcoming me to your course. I'm Vance Ricks. This is my 2.5 year at Northeastern. I have a joint appointment, as was mentioned, in philosophy and computer science. I have a background as a philosophy major in college, but during summer times I was working at IBM as a programmer and then went to work there full-time for a couple of years after graduation before going back to grad school in philosophy. So I've had a long-standing interest in sort of biography that combines those two subject areas. Here at Northeastern, I do a couple of things. One of the courses that I teach that some of you may be familiar with is called Technology and Human Values. This is a philosophy course, but 90% of the students who are enrolled in it are from Corey. So they are either a data science major, a cybersecurity major, or a computer science major. And that's a course that's focused specifically on the kinds of ethical and socio-political questions that arise in the context of emerging technologies and existing technologies. Since most of those students are from Corey, I tend to focus more on digital technologies than on other forms of technology. But there's a lot of different ways that you can teach that course. And every semester there are probably 6 or 7 sections of the course that are being offered by 3 or 4 instructors, so each of us does it a little bit differently. The other thing I do is to work with other Corey faculty to embed what are called ethics modules into their courses. So rather than having a semester-length focus on a specific ethical question that may come up in a cybersecurity course, for example, I design an ethics module that focuses on a specific kind of case study and then can come into the course and talk the students through how they might apply ethical reasoning and analysis to that specific case. My own interest in terms of research is on friendship. That's what I wrote my dissertation on in philosophy, but more recently I'm thinking about friendship in the context of our interactions with artificial agents. So things like robots, but also things like chatbots and conversational agents. Questions about in what ways do those resemble friendships and some of the things that we find valuable about friendships? Could they in some way provide training wheels for kinds of friendships that we want to have between other humans? Are there ways in which there may actually be the possibility of real friendship between a human and one of these artificial agents? So as I'm thinking about AI, I'm thinking about a couple of things. First of all is the terminology itself. So just to lay my cards on the table, I think it's mostly a marketing term because it seems to refer to so many different things that all are just basically complex forms of software, many of which do different kinds of things, have different underlying software paradigms, that it's not always clear what people mean when they say AI. So I'm going to try to be more specific and talk about systems that in some way do things that if a human did them, we would say required some kind of intelligence. That just pushes the conversation back by one step, but that's where I am right now. So there are, I think, 3 things that I want my students to focus on as I think about that. One of them is the labor that's happening behind the screen. So a lot of the magic that's made possible through things like conversational agents and chatbots and whatnot requires some of the same kind of content moderation that is required in the case of social media sites. So for example, if you don't want your chatbot spouting anti-Semitic things, you have to train it to be able to recognize what counts as anti-Semitic. And what that means is you need a small army of humans reading a bunch of anti-Semitic stuff that they can label, this is anti-Semitic, so that when the model encounters that sort of thing, it understands, right, don't give an answer that contains something that looks like this. So there's a labor issue that I think sometimes goes underexplored and under-discussed when we're thinking about AI systems. The second thing that I think is important to think about is governance, and I guess we're probably all concerned about that as well. A lot of international and national bodies all sort of converged on the first week of November as the time when they were going to issue various policy documents and executive orders. So a lot of national and international actors are sort of thinking more broadly about societal implications of these new technological systems. Unfortunately, we're also in a bit of a Cold War with one of the other major global players, and so just what that means and the ramifications for coordinating kind of sensible responses, I think, has yet to be determined. And then the third thing that I want my students to focus on, a lot of people are very worried about automation and what it means for work that they find meaningful and fulfilling. To say nothing of work that actually pays money, right? But even just the idea that something you enjoy doing, but that some automated system might do a little bit faster than you or a little bit more comprehensively than you, might make it possible for someone to decide that they don't need to pay you anymore to do that work. So as a philosophy course, Tech and Human Values also asks students to reflect on what it is that makes work meaningful, or what it is that makes meaning about any of the activities that we engage in, whether we call them work or not. And are there ways in which we could continue to find that sort of meaning, even in a world where some of the work that we do is assisted by or even replaced by artificial agents? So I'll stop there.
Great.
Okay. So yeah, we launched the AI Literacy Lab, which Professor Wibby is also involved in, and we launched it a couple months after ChatGPT was unleashed on the world, and it was an interesting moment because AI has been around for a long time. A lot of the functions on your phone are powered by machine learning and artificial intelligence, your facial recognition and your autofill, and there's a lot that AI was doing. ChatGPT, I think, came on the scene and mimicked human speech in such a compelling way that all of a sudden people started thinking about AI in a completely different way, and there was a lot of exuberance and fear in the media coverage about it that I think fed a lot of exuberance and fear among the public. And one of the things that we wanted to do with this new initiative was to change the conversation and create a more informed conversation so that there was a better informed public about AI, so that then there could be better policy about AI, So part of what we've been doing is kind of surveying the field and trying to figure out where the conversation currently stands about AI and where the gaps can be filled. I come at this project as a journalist. That's my background, and so it's been really interesting to watch in that specific industry people grappling with AI and its implications. I brought this. This is like my show and tell that I've been bringing around to classes when I talk about AI, because the initial fear, and you may have covered this a little bit as I was walking in, the initial fear among journalists as AI enters their field is it going to start writing my stories, and is it going to replace me specifically as a writer? And there actually have been experiments in that front. Some big newspaper chains like Gannett have experimented with publishing stories written by AI. This is one, I think it was a Gannett, this one ran on MSN, Microsoft Network, the kind of online arm of Microsoft, and it ran in September. And the headline, it's a sports story, and the headline is "Brandon Hunter Useless at 42." It's about a former NBA player. I'll just read the first sentence. Former NBA participant Brandon Hunter, who beforehand performed for the Boston Celtics and Orlando Magic, has handed away on the age of 42. This is a story about an AI-written story about a basketball player who died. And someone clearly was not minding the store and let this story with the headline, "Brandon Hunter, Useless at 42," about a dead person, go out into the world. So this is an indication of the limitations of AI writing stories and the problems that happen when you just sort of unleash it without any kind of oversight, which everyone responsible in the industry realizes you shouldn't do. So there's a lot of fear of this, and that's understandable and founded. There's also, though, a lot of possibility and potential for AI to be a really useful tool for journalists in general, and I think for local journalists in particular, where you've got these tiny outlets that don't have a lot of resources and are trying to cover a lot of things and a lot of entities at the same time. And so if you could imagine using AI as a tool, as sort of a super smart, super fast Google searching intern to do things like take transcripts or take recordings of public meetings, turn them into transcripts and summarize those transcripts. There are functions where the AI is just helping you do your work of covering a large area faster. And if it's used responsibly and with the right guardrails and with the right thought going into it, and you use it and you follow up as a reporter, there are ways that's just one example of ways that AI could be used as a tool. So that's the kind of conversation that we're trying to have and broaden and make people understand what AI can do, what it shouldn't do, what its implications are, and how we can use it as a tool to help.
Okay.
That's
All
it.
right. There's not much to say after these two, but I'll offer a few thoughts. So I was thinking back in 2019, I wrote a book, and there's a whole chapter on AI. I realized like most of it's wrong. So my prognostications here, like take it with a grain of salt and a caveat. But I'm as somebody who worries about the public sphere and how human beings come together to form communities and govern their communities. I'm quite worried about a few different things, and they all kind of revolve around this idea that democracy and the form of government and the form of sort of communities that we, I think, value really requires a lot of social contact and a lot of generation of knowledge and information socially together as human beings. And I'm sort of puzzling these days over how exactly AI, which can contribute a lot to us as individuals, then affects, and this lines up with what Professor Riggs is saying, like how it affects friendships and relationships, particularly in civic life and in political life. So let me give you a few sort of example areas. So one would be polling. So for 100 years, we've had this practice of going out and connecting with a sample of the public to try to figure out what people think about any given issue. There's a world in which maybe a year from now, maybe 10 years from now, we can start to train instead of polling 1,000 people, we would train 1,000 interactive agents whose preferences would look a lot like a human agent, or a human being, I should say. And would we start releasing polling data that's essentially synthetic polling data? I don't know. I mean, what does that mean? I've already talked to people about doing this kind of thing. We're starting to have the kind of data from humans that we could then train the interactive agents to then respond to the polls. What does that mean? What does it mean for a whole town or a whole region or a whole state to be covered by an interactive AI-powered news agent? There's been a lot of aspiration in journalism for us to do what's called engaged journalism or network journalism, where the audience, the human audience, and the journalist would be very much sort of a co-designer of information and of stories, and there was a generative cycle that a lot of us are, in the theory kind of world of journalism studies, thought was like a very, very valuable model to aspire to, especially as social media came about. But what happens when it's just an agent, right? It's covering everything. How does that work? And then think about content moderation, right? So right now, it's a mess, right? On social, we know that. But we do have a lot of high quality argument among human beings right now, still, right? And that has a value to it in public discourse. But what happens when the companies start to unleash chat mods and mod bots? And there's certainly experiments in Reddit and some different places where that's happening. But I know on fairly good information that a lot of the companies are thinking about this kind of thing. What does that mean when you sort of have interactive agents participating in public conversations who we might identify as synthetic agents, but they're now playing an active role on the platforms. How does that diminish that? How does that diminish public knowledge and participation in the public sphere? And then finally, just search. I mean, search and discovery. Yes, the chatbots can do a wonderful job synthesizing information more quickly, but there's something incredibly important about us educating ourselves in a deliberate and intentional way. And so when we're being fed, just snippets of summaries, we lose something. We're going to lose something that's important about participating with other human beings in our collective sense making and our collective education. So I think there's just if you think about an informed public as crucial to a functioning democracy, you have to start to wonder how AI is going to facilitate this kind of collective sense making, collective public knowledge. So I worry about all that. All that said, I do think AI could be a very good potential defender of the information environment. There's a big question in the kind of the security circles right now about whether AI will be a net positive for defense or offense. And I actually think that there's a pretty good case that maybe AI is actually going to help us defend the information environment. So those are just things that are on my mind, and they're a little abstract, but I hope they're useful.
Questions? So I guess one question I have is, where do you see, we talked a little bit about Moore's Law with sort of the exponential growth there. If we brought you back 3 years from now, where do you think we'll be in AI? I mean, will it be much better? And I'm especially intrigued by this kind of human AI interaction. Speaking to what Professor Wibby talked about, are you more optimistic about that because we can somehow use AI as a way to make people better humans or more, willing to listen or something?
So one of my philosophical heroes coined a term, technosocial opacity, and that's just a shorthand way of saying humans are really, really bad at accurately predicting, even over the short term, the social implications and effects of new technological systems. Just as a species, we have a pretty poor track record of that. So that makes me very reluctant to speculate about anything happening 3 years from now, let alone further. So with that caveat, let me now speculate about something 3 years from now. So I want to back up actually and connect it to what John was saying about the polis and about our social societal engagement. So one of the things that we know, at least in the United States, is there's a kind of ongoing crisis of detachment and loneliness and isolation. People report one close friend. You survey Americans now about how many close friends do you have, and it's in the low single digits. 30 years ago, it was at least 6. Right, so that seems like a bad direction for things to be heading in for a lot of reasons. So part of me wants to think and does think. I don't know that I want that we solve the loneliness crisis by giving everyone their own chatbot or their own replica. Free advertising for a software company there that they can an artificial agent that they can create. I do think it's important that it's not a technical or technological problem, right? That there are underlying causes that I think could be addressed in some way by technology, but I think there are other things that we should look to first when we're thinking about rebuilding those sorts of third spaces and sort of willingness to get to know each other and spend time around people who are different from us and all of those other cliches that are meaningful that we say a lot. When it comes to kind of other forms of social interaction, I suppose one thing that I do think about is so the information environment. I want to hear more actually about why you're positive that, like, on balance, that AI agents could actually make the information environment better, or that they could. That's not what you said specifically,
Yeah.
but that they could protect more than they harm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have strong evidence. Right? In fact, it's all speculative, as you said. I think, well, part of it is that the big variable is what the companies are going to do with these models, right? Because
Yeah.
they're proprietary, they're extremely expensive, and their decision to either help or hurt. We think about Elon creating Grok, right? I mean that. So the calculus could change, but I think that because the power right now resides with companies that I think we should be very critical of and question, but I think on balance, companies like Google and OpenAI are going to tend or trend toward defense of a kind of stable information environment. I think it's to their advantage. So I'm not sure I have a good answer, but I think a lot depends on where the corporate power goes.
Yeah, but because I'm also thinking, so a lot of conversations like these are focused on the sort of supply side of mis and disinformation. There's the demand side, right? A lot of us want this stuff, right? A lot of us don't necessarily want the full menu of political expression and discomforting and offensive beliefs and alternative perspectives on things. So for me, again, partly it's a technological question, but it's also partly about us and why is it that there is such a ready market for this sort of thing? It didn't come into being with the existence of Facebook or other kinds of social media, right? It was that may have turbocharged various things that were already well underway, right? And so I think this is also an opportunity for us to be reflecting on our own information habits, but that's also about the fact that in a lot of ways we're not seeking information to become better informed, right? We're seeking information as a better way of signaling the team that we belong to, or the people that we're different from. And I think it requires a lot of introspection and action to work on that part, right? So is that something that you see AI as being able to help with, do you think?
Do you want to jump in?
Either of you,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying makes me think of, one of the more interesting developments there's a lot of fear about AI spreading misinformation and the ability, it's so easy now to create a photo that looks very realistic that is actually not, and there's a lot of fear that, and particularly when there's an event like a war going on
Or
and
a presidential
or a
election.
presidential election. So one of the effects is that one of the potential things that could happen is that people could create these photos, and that certainly has happened. But one thing that's happened certainly around the Gaza war is that it has also created a reaction. The public is so well aware of that risk that now people are also doubting the provenance of real photos, and they're doubting real information. And that's where things get really muddy, is when you have created an information environment where you don't know what's true and what isn't. You're maybe inclined to think that people aren't telling the truth, even if they are, and then you don't know, well, who is the correct broker of that information? Who can you trust to tell you? And that's where, we're so polarized right now in our media consumption in a lot of cases that we're not going to believe, side A just because it's side A. Who are the middle of the road brokers? And I think that and is technology a neutral party? Like, could AI be actually a neutral party in that front, as opposed to humans who have biases? Like, it's just an interesting problem that we all have to sort out.
Well, it is going to be an arms race between the cutting edge models and the bad actors who want to exploit whatever models they can get their hands on, and that will just be a constant race. Like the provenance of a photo is increasingly like a tractable problem for the cutting edge AI models. They could do a lot of stuff to determine the validity of photos, and that is truly an arms race, right? The ability to generate things that look like reality but aren't, and the ability to detect that. And so I just to me, the billions spent by Microsoft and Google, and I guess by extension OpenAI with Microsoft and some of the others, like, the bad actors cannot keep up with that right now. Now, will some of these models just become widely available and open sourced and they'll be good enough? Probably, but again, the arms race, I think, is important to keep our eyes on. But
What about governments, though? I mean, couldn't China? I mean, China's dealt with a lot of what we think of as positive sides of the internet by blocking it. And they're using all sorts of AI tools for oppression and tracking people. When you said it's in the hands of corporations now, but Vance, you mentioned that, you know, we're in a Cold War with one of the other big operators. I mean, is it that simple, or do we have to worry what China today, Russia tomorrow, you know, the US at some point could get involved and use these as tools for evil as opposed to good?
So again, wanting to be very clear about the limitations of my expertise, I'm not a political scientist or expert in international affairs, so this is just, I know basically what I read. So, well, I know a little bit more than that. Okay, so you're asking specifically about something like what's sometimes called the splinternet, where there could be multiple internets, for example, each with its own set of norms, each governed by a different entity like a nation state or some collection of nation states like the EU, or Southeast Asian countries, let's say. And so that's a different thing from the kinds of questions that might be raised by corporate oversight, but I think there's a lot of overlap too, right? Because the similar questions about what are we going to allow to be said, or what are we going to allow to be thought, in terms of what we show, or what we hide, or what we suppress, or what we boost, as well as the kinds of technical and technological affordances that are part of our system. So if you think about something like infinite scroll, right, that was a technology that was an addition, right? It didn't come into being.
Can you describe what infinite scroll?
I'm sorry. So right, when you're this is all over the place now, but say you're using TikTok or even email, where you can just keep, basically, you never come to the bottom of the page, right? Every time you scroll up, there's always more stuff, and it just fills in, and you can keep scrolling up and keep scrolling, right? And so that's specifically engineered to keep you looking, right? The sort of intermittent reward that works really well in lab rats also works really well in humans, right? That, okay, maybe this will be the time that I get a new email, or this will be the time that some new cool video I haven't already seen arises. So to connect it back to the sort of global governance question and whether governments are doing certain things or not, I think they're still relying on exactly the same kind of technological mechanisms that corporations are. Maybe it's not for a profit motive, right? But ultimately it's to capture people's attention.
Since journalism is one of the main providers of information in society, how optimistic or pessimistic are each of you about AI's role as a news gatherer and effectively a publisher of information?
I mean, I think I would say we need to, as an industry, come up with, and people are working on this, but it's very much a work in progress, sort of rules and guidelines, first of all, but also just kind of an understanding, again, of what AI can do and what it can. We hosted a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a couple of people who are doing an experimental news outlet in the town of Arlington, Massachusetts, just north of here, and they put together a website where they're basically taking the cable access TV recordings of the, umpty 7,000 public meetings that are in any town, the planning board and the zoning board and this board and that board, and they're getting an AI, program to turn that voice into text, and then another program, really basically like GPT-4, to summarize in bullet points. And it's very boring by design. It's just the facts, and they're just kind of putting that out in front of the public and saying, well, here's public information for you, and it is as far as it goes. But here's the problem with thinking about that as a replacement for journalism, is that any journalist knows that just what happens in front of the meeting is not the story. It's part of the story, but what happens in the back is the story, and what happens in the questions asked, and what happens in the tone of voice, and what happens in the back room. And so there is still no substitute for sending a human to a meeting or sending the human to kind of do. So it's I think that the risk is that you use this technology and take it too far and sort of and see it as the end, as opposed to seeing it as getting you part way. And I think that's the danger, I think, is kind of relying on it too much to write your headlines, to write your metadata, to cover your meetings without, and it's not even just a human touch to make sure that it doesn't say something really offensive about someone who died. Like that's like just the sort of basic table stakes, but it's really about like, how do you guard against not adding the context and the human understanding to anything that you cover?
What would you prioritize as the subjects that the federal government should be discussing at this point about AI? I mean, there's a lot going on and it's happening really fast, and Congress probably won't be able to keep up with it, but what would you see as their priorities for potential legislation or regulation?
Do you want to go?
I mean, I'll just say something very brief, which is that we're focusing mostly on information and communication, as you know. I think that's appropriate given who's on the panel. But you know, biotechnology and the health and medical sciences are you know, going to people say, you know, there's a sort of revolution going on there. But with that is going to come a huge number of ethical questions about, you know, whether it's genetics or whether it's, you know, potential bioweapon generation. I mean, I think that's the area that I think is really something completely beyond my understanding and my field. So I'm going to defer maybe to Professor Riggs.
The philosopher?
Yeah. He's probably thought about some of these things.
Well, so
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about the executive order that the Biden administration issued recently, and if you read the executive summary of the executive order, because the order itself is a couple of thousand words, so if you're ever ill over a weekend and just need something to occupy your time, I don't mean to make light of it, right? But it takes a long time to get through. But fortunately, they wrote a sort of condensed version. And one of the things that I think was hopeful, but also perplexing to me, is that it seemed as though they were listening to a lot of different kinds of people with different kinds of expertise and concerns about complex computer systems and AI. And so it also means, as a result, that the executive order looks like a kind of grab bag of a lot of different kinds of issues. So everything from the kind of things that John was just describing to one of the things that I mentioned earlier, like labor concerns, intellectual property concerns,
Right.
things about systems that may be able to, if it's a really sophisticated conversational agent, maybe it could trick you into giving it a password or into doing something that has effects in the real world, not just the computer world, which is also the real world, but you know what I mean. So which of those should be the priority? I don't know. So one thing I do think is there are current harms that some people are currently experiencing because of decisions made by automated systems. And so I think one priority should be better understanding of those harms and ways to mitigate.
Can you give some examples?
Well, so things like deciding who receives welfare benefits or who's eligible for them in the first place. Certainly I know that you assigned the article about Compass and sort of sentencing decisions or input into sentencing and probation decisions. Even things like admissions decisions, hiring decisions. Many of you are going to be applying to jobs where there will not be a human who reads your resume at all, right? There will be certain keywords that it's looking for, and if it doesn't find them, it goes automatically into the rejection pile, right? And no human will ever look at it. So when we think about what you're owed, what you deserve, questions about merit, questions about recourse, questions even about explanation, right? Can you explain to me why I got auto-rejected? We need deep thinking and accounting about all of those things, and so I think that would be a priority for me as well, sort of the ability to explain and give account for certain kinds of decision. So before we get to the question of whether these machines will come to life and destroy us all, there are current real harms, and we can think about the very speculative possible future harms, but I don't want to do that until we're focused on the things that are actually happening right now, and again, trying to prevent and mitigate those.
I mean, built-in bias is a well-known and a big concern, you know, both in the sort of the bot and the things that the bot is reading, facial recognition software, and I think, you know, if there are regulations that, I mean, it's really at that point, it's a lot about the training data and the work that goes into training. And I think, you know, from what I understand, one of the elements of the executive order is that the government is kind of requesting, demanding information about the training data when a new tool is created that has a certain threshold of power. There's a request that the training data, there's visibility into the training data, which feels like, not complete, but a start. If you understand, it's like bad in, bad out. If you understand what's going in, and if you create some demands and some structure about what's allowed to go in, you can have some greater sense of control over what comes out.
But the government has already failed spectacularly at doing that
Mhm.
just with the web.
Well, so much of this moment of desire and demand for regulation, I think, is a reaction to what happened with social media, where these social media companies came up 20 years ago, and Congress was like, what's this? And I don't know, looking over here, and these companies just created this incredible sort of superstructure that has become essentially an information highway. It's effectively a public utility. It has changed discourse, I think, like on the whole for the worse. I mean, is that there've been some positives and some benefits to that kind of connectivity, but it has altered discourse in such a profound way that we're still grappling with it. At the very least, the government is now like, let's try not to do that again with AI, which I see as a positive development.
To me, the most important thing, I was talking about biotechnology before.
John, can you speak
but-
up a little bit?
Oh yeah, sure. Just back to information and communication. I do think the thing the government has to focus very squarely on is the concept of imposters, right? The idea that agents will deceive people for a whole host of reasons, but primarily for financial gain. And I think that's where regulation has to be. There have to be absolute bright lines. Joanna helped lead a multi-country survey, which we haven't entirely released. But one of the things that across countries, people were absolutely clear on is that they want interactive agents to be labeled clearly, and the possibilities now to defraud, like everyone over 75, for example, are very high, because we know the technological literacy of seniors is just sort of not as good as sort of people who are younger. And I mean, financial fraud with older people is a gigantic problem in this country, and in the next few years you could just imagine it going out of control, and the government, I think, has to get like a real handle on that. Not to say that 18-year-olds or 22-year-olds can't also be defrauded, but it's going to be incredibly easy. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but
Yeah, I mean, so as all of us get closer to that age that you were mentioning, we get a little salty when people start talking about how technologically illiterate we are, and grandma is always brought out as the example of the sort of quintessentially technically illiterate person. So I understand what you're saying. I'll just broaden it to, we don't want anyone to be defrauded, right? And we don't, and in particular, you can get a phone call that's going to sound exactly like the voice of some loved one, saying exactly the kinds of things that person would say, telling you that you need to open your bank account and pay, or bad things are going to happen to them. And maybe someone younger would be less gullible about that, but
But maybe
it's
not.
just,
Yeah,
maybe not.
But
I feel like public literacy and sort of media literacy is a part of that. I think like we've all gotten better at identifying phishing emails. Like they're the tells, they get better and better, and you can still like every week I feel like there's a new trick. But so it's like keeping on top of that is going to be a challenge, and it's gonna. I think you're right. The government can set some boundaries or attempt to, but a lot of this is going to be on the consumer to understand the risks and to be able to identify them.
yeah.
And I think there's been a move, so going back to Al Gore and the information superhighway, I think maybe in terms of the United States context and regulation, there's been that sort of initial move that, well, when we're thinking about something like the internet, the best agency is the FCC, because we want to compare it to a sort of common carrier, and we think that the best policy decision is one where the government doesn't favor any particular direction, and we just let the marketplace figure that out. I think now, partly because of social media's depredations and other kinds of thing, now it's more moving away from the FCC and more towards the FTC and FDA, where First,
Can
you're
you
going to have to
describe the difference?
Okay, so the Federal Trade Commission and the Food and Drug Administration, as opposed to the Federal Communications Commission. So the Federal Trade Commission currently is helmed by Lena Khan. Many of you probably are familiar with her and some of the work that has been done under her watch in that agency. But one of their main remits is to protect us in our guise in our role as consumers from fraudulent and deceptive and harmful products and claims about products. Food and Drug Administration does that again, but also more narrowly focused on what we eat and what kinds of things are labeled as medication. And in the FDA case, the presumption is you first have to show that it's not harmful before we're going to let you put it out there. And that's not what was done with social media and most other kinds of technological innovations. I'll use the word in scare quotations over the past couple of decades. And so I think now people are sort of thinking when it comes to these AI technologies, we need to move the burden of proof back over there, right? That first you need to show us that this is not going to make our society worse, and then maybe we'll let you release it, or and in particular under certain guidelines and conditions.
I want to open it up to the students, but I also wanted to ask kind of on this idea of regulation. So how many of you, when you go home or you deal with, over Thanksgiving or whenever, will be asked at some point by your parents or grandparents to help them with a remote or to help them with their cell phone or to sort of do something for them technologically? And so I was looking at this, and so the Supreme Court, the average age I think is now 63 or 64. In the Senate it's 65. The House is youngsters, 57. We obviously know about the two presidential candidates. And I'm wondering, both your speculation but also in your interaction with students, is there a difference in the ability and the expectations of Gen Z to deal with these issues and the way they look at them versus the, I guess now, Gen X baby boomers, but those older folks are still kind of in charge, and I'm wondering how that kind of affects possible regulation or even the ability to understand. As Joanna said, the Facebook hearings were a joke because it was all the 20 and 30 something staffers showing the 70-year-old senator how to use Facebook.
Do you want to go first?
No, let's make it easier on that. We'll start with you, Joe.
I waded inadvertently into ageism, so I apologize. I'm realizing, though the data does support
John
it
is making me feel old.
It is a massive. I was reviewing multiple proposals for a government agency that was just trying to tackle this problem. So it is a thing, but I understand the optics aren't great. Yes, I mean, I think I have at least one. Do I have Anna? Are you? Hi. So I have at least one person who's hearing me drone on again for the second time today. But and so I'll characterize the entire class now as I think they have a thicker skin in some ways than I do. Just the I don't know. I'm almost pushing 50, and I think because I wasn't sort of entirely born digital, I still get weirded out and offended by things that they often seem to just sort of roll with. I mean, that's part of it. That's just
like what?
Just offensive, or just kind of rough and tumble language, imagery, all kinds of stuff. And I don't know. Maybe it's just what you grew up with, and so you just sort of know yeah, that's kind of that's the internet, right?
And is that true?
Yeah.
Do you have a thicker skin?
I mean, I don't know. I think, I guess what I thought of when you said that was we had to do an AI assignment. I think it was the image one.
The Midjourney, yeah.
Of the assignment, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. You got an A. Don't worry about it.
But I know one thing that our class talked a lot about was that when we were putting in to AI what we wanted it to produce, a lot of the times there was no diversity in any of the imagery that AI produced. So that was a huge point of conversation in that class, and I think a lot of people. I don't know if I would say offended is the correct word, but it was definitely something that we noticed, and we were this is a little bit concerning in regards to utilizing AI.
Yeah, almost like a separate point, but a better one than I made, actually.
Sorry.
And I will say, I think the expectations for how good technology should be are just higher. I think, I mean, I'm sort of like, oh, I guess Midjourney fails, and like this is terrible because it replicates bias. And you guys are like, that we are not going to stand for this. Like, we do not like Midjourney. We do not like what you're doing. And I just think that was, it was like I think there was a generational difference there. And I don't know.
So I'm feeling old, and I'm gonna go younger than you guys. So I'm gonna assume that you guys' frontal lobes are better developed than my 15-year-old son. But here's a concern that I have when I see my 15-year-old son, as 15-year-olds are, is extremely online, and he's extremely online with his friends, and everything is the speed, the ease of communication is so great, and the ability to think through to the next step is not so great. And so I'm constantly, aware of things that he and his friends are saying to each other online that may not be viewed favorably if someone were were to see it. I have explained to him probably 753 times that what is on what you think of as your private Discord chat is not necessarily private, and he still doesn't believe me. And I've shown him articles, like I hand him articles, and he's like, "Yeah, whatever, mom." But I think, I guess my concern is that things move so fast, and in this world you cannot take them back. So that goes for personal communication, and it goes for misinformation. It's like the speed at which something what's the Mark Twain aphorism about, like, the lie gets halfway around the world while the truth is tying its shoes. It's like the lie is just encircling the world, and there's no pulling back from it. And I think maybe, I don't know, maybe older people, like you said, are more cautious.
I'm
Maybe,
the same way with my kids. Yeah.
but maybe
like-
you guys are more aware of the dangers. Save us. But but that's the kind of thing that I worry about.
Yeah, it's somewhat of an ethical question, but this is all being developed and happening in an atmosphere where journalism and trust in journalism is at an all-time low, and where over the past decade we've all learned that mediating agents like journalists or even like university professors are no longer seen as either fair, trusted arbiters of what people should know or need to know. And so the idea that a much more vast quantity of everything is going to be available to everything in an atmosphere where there sort of are no trusted mediators, not government, not journalists. Like, what will that be like, and how maybe will new mediators be empowered to at least try, not necessarily to regulate, but to perform the ethical duty of providing the public with the truth, with what is thought to be the truth.
I don't know. I agree with you about sort of the condition that we face. I think there may be some things to be said in its favor, such as when there were 3 white men on my TV screen every night telling me what's real, or that they were presented as the voices of authority. So I want to acknowledge that there have been some improvements in terms of whose voices are allowed to count as authoritative in the first place, whose word is taken to be sort of de facto veridical, right? So I do think, and all of us as university people are constantly talking about the importance of critical thinking. So it's not that I don't understand. It's not that I don't understand where this maybe ends up eating itself or swallowing itself, right? But even the people who say things like, "Well, I do my own research," Well, no, they don't. They're making a different decision about whom to consider authoritative and whom to consider trustworthy. Maybe those are quote non-standard sources, but it's not as if they've abandoned the notion of trustworthiness or of even truth, right? It's that they find those things elsewhere. So I think we would be in real trouble, and I think that, John, this is what you were alluding to earlier, where the environment is just so flooded with so many confabulated things that people just abandon the idea that they can know anything at all. I don't think that most people are yet at that point. So I do think there's at least hope that even if it's not going to be the same 3 news channels and there's going to be a multiplicity of
gone
sources.
from that.
Yeah, right.
By
So I don't think the alternative is nobody believes anything or no one believes anyone, right? So I think you're just going to see more sort of localized, contested claims to authority and to trustworthiness.
One of the problems that Jill and Jonathan, you know incredibly well, better than any. I mean, you have world experts here on journalism and its business model. You may remember we had Bloomberg Technologies. Actually, Jonathan is a former executive editor of Bloomberg. Come in by Zoom and just talk to us about what they were doing. Do you remember? Do you want to describe it, or I can just? Yeah, it's okay. So it was a team of 2 or 3 people who were essentially taking press releases and other forms of information and using AI tools to create like very, very short, but reasonably accurate like news snippets that they would then syndicate. And I forget what their estimates were, but that on a given day without these tools, I'm going to get these numbers wrong, don't quote me, but it was sort of like we might be able to do 100 and now we can do 5,000. And what they realized is that the economic markets just have an endless appetite for thinner and thinner slices of information. And I did wonder if that insight that could help journalistic business models in certain ways. In other words, the business desks, maybe some of the political desks, could just create increasingly narrow, tailored products that could prop up the shrinking newsroom a bit, and maybe keep some of those like political reporters and people who are doing that important democracy work like as a cross subsidy. I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know if you want to respond.
Yeah, I think the question it raises, though, that even if the business model is improved, is anybody out there listening?
Right.
And are fewer and fewer people.
Yeah.
And I guess that's sort of a philosophical question. I mean, so, I covered China for a long time. I lived in China. And, it's the Chinese, the Communist Party, essentially has a view of the world that's fundamentally different from ours. And the EU has a view that's fundamentally different in terms of the role of government. China believes that chaos is a bad thing, and that you want to control things. And you can trace that back to Confucianism or Mao, whatever. But there is this argument there, which others have put forward, is that in the 21st century, that model is more successful economically and politically. The EU believes in more government, more regulation, and we are on the side of, no, let people figure it out, individuals are important. Are those all equally valid, and is that the way kind of people make these decisions because they have a political philosophy or a deeper philosophy that says, this is how I want to use AI?
Equally valid. So I think you're absolutely right that there are certainly historical reasons that we can point to about why certain kinds of polities exist or certain kinds of political organizations exist with the kind of value rankings that they have. Are you asking whether there's some external point of view that we can use to adjudicate between them and say, well, this is the best one, or this is the better one?
Right? Or are we bound by that there's always going to be conflict, because if AI becomes a tool, it becomes a tool for that philosophy. And are they equally valid? I mean, are we going to be arguing with the Chinese about AI or about their political philosophy versus our political philosophy?
Right. Well, so when you phrase it that way, I think I can now do a better job of answering. So it's true that individually as well as collectively, we have lots of different ideas about what a good life is, right? Both individually and collectively. And so there are going to be different communities that have different visions of what it means to live well and what you need in order to do that. And so that means our technologies and the ways we use them are also going to reflect kind of those different conceptions. We haven't talked much about the so-called Global South, for example, and other conceptions that need to be added to the conversation in terms of what it is to live well, how technologies can help with that, how they might get in the way. So I don't know that beyond a kind of thin consensus of things like try not to kill babies, right? I
Child
think,
pornography.
well, right. So there might be some sort of thin consensus that's globally possible, right? But if you're asking about at a more substantive level, what can we all agree to? The answer is I don't know. I don't know.
I just want to pick on the Global South argument. What do you think are the things we should be thinking about for the Global South, or that the Global South is thinking about in terms of the positive or negative aspects of AI?
Okay, so again, thinking about a U.S. context, you can point to the Bay Area, kind of draw a circle, 10-mile radius, let's say 30-mile radius, right? It's remarkable to me that that's the epicenter, this tiny group of people who have a very kind of weird vision about how they want the future to look, and their roles in it, and the roles that computerized technology is going to play in it, and the importance of free speech, and all of those things. That's the ideological center that's driving so much of how the rest of the world communicates with each other, what we think is okay to say or show, or what's possible for us to show, right? How much of it is in English? So, right, why is it that's that one little group has such outsized influence on the whole world, right? Why is it that a lot of the actual labor that I was talking about earlier is done by people in the Global South that we never see and don't have to see, but makes all of this stuff that we have possible, right? When do those people get to be part of the conversation about the sets of values and priorities that are going to drive technological development, right? As subjects, and not just as people who get hired to do this work.
And what do you think they would ask for?
Well, the term decolonization gets thrown around a lot. I don't know that everyone, so we're talking again about billions of people, so I don't know that there's going to be a sort of univocal answer to the question. But I think at the very least, it's kind of decentering of the United States, the European Union, and China.
I think a first order priority is
Can you speak up, John?
yes, a first order priority is just going to be linguistic capability and understanding. So these models are almost wholly trained on English, so right now, and so I think across the Global South, there's going to be a great demand that if these models are going to be used in their markets, they need to be able to have a supple grasp of language, and with nuance and with updated training data sets. And one of the problems Joanna referenced, that social media sort of exploded on the world without a lot of safeguards around it. And one of the things that continues to be the case is that almost all of the automated classifier systems that help with content moderation and security are still English focused. And so we have huge problems in global markets because of this. And so I think that's going to be a first order priority, is that a demand that the models are properly trained.
Language and culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, we saw this in the Facebook papers, right? So there's a new whistleblower, but the
Yeah,
earlier
that's
whistleblower, Frances Haugen, so the papers that she helped bring to light talked about this thing that you were just saying, which is 10% of Facebook's user base is in the United States, but 80% of their content moderation is focused on what's happening in the United States. So meanwhile, in places like India, where you have lots of different communities with different languages, and each language has its own nuances, they, by their own reckoning, didn't have nearly enough people who spoke those languages and knew those communities and were parts of those communities to actually be able to do effective moderating of content.
Well, then, yeah, whose obligation is it to do that moderating? And then this just goes back to your original question about capitalism. Like, these companies are making a lot of money, even if they're retrenching slightly post-pandemic. They're making a lot of money. They have all the money in the world to pour resources into content moderation. What's the vehicle and the lever for making them do that?
You asking?
I guess it's a rhetorical question, but if you have an answer, I'd like to hear it.
Regulation. I mean, I think what the European Union is doing, or what India is doing with its information technology rules, or Brazil. Many countries are now considering more stringent regulation on a lot of these global information technology companies, and I think that's going to force that's going to force companies to come to the table, and basically the deal will be, if you want to play in our market and serve a user base here, you have to do X, Y, and Z. And I think, the Digital Services Act, which, if you don't know about it, that Europe and its 27 or so collective countries, it's actually the biggest market in the world. And just recently, this year, they finally sort of put on the books this sort of massive new set of regulations for social media. Transparency, accountability, responsibility. There's a whole bunch of things in there. But suddenly, there's a model outside of the Chinese or American model, which is a kind of middle path. And Jonathan referenced it earlier, but it's incredibly important because it's starting to change. Everyone in leadership around the world is starting to say, hey, well, we should have our rules too. And so something very important is happening out there. And I'm sure the AI models are going to be a part of this same conversation.
And
There
maybe
we are.
AI will be useful because from what I gather, content moderation is one of the worst jobs in the world.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
basically
Yeah.
you're a human looking at all of this horrible
Yeah.
crap and determining whether it's too horrible. So maybe
Yeah.
the bots can be enlisted to
Yeah.
at least do some of that work.
Yeah.
Why is the United States so much farther behind Europe and the rest of the world in terms of these regulations?
Don't you think part of the answer is that our country, since Ronald Reagan, has become very ideologically anti-regulation, which is not true of Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, the default, I think, in the country is to be anti-regulatory at this point. And I think it's not a good development, but it just is.
Well, I think it's anti-regulatory, and I think that there's this is part of the same piece, is this sort of bias toward innovation, and that's the ethos of Silicon Valley that you were talking about, that move fast and break things and do
But
it
that
make it
is
first, think
also a
later.
libertarian ethos.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, but it allowed a lot of very fast growth and the building of these creations before anyone and without, and that's why what you were talking about at the very beginning about sort of baking ethics into the education of computer science, so that people are thinking about the potential problems and thinking about the potential bad outcomes as they're building the thing, rather than building the thing and then going, oh, oops, that happened. Well, how are we going to put a lid on that?
How can artistic and writing creators, both of books and journalism, make sure that their work isn't just taken for free as chum for AI? How
Asking
is
for a
the
friend.
What do you think?
I don't. So earlier in my class, the one I was mentioning that I teach, the technology and human values course, I had one of our class sessions was earlier today, and we're in the unit now on AI actually. So I had asked today that the students, since we had been living in all of these different problems, like the ones we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, I said, well, okay, for today's class, I'd like you to bring in an example of some kind of AI system that you're excited about. Right, so to get them thinking about, well, what is something that I think not as just not harmful, but that
But
actually
positive.
could be positive. So right, so one of the examples is a tool that's called Sanative, and
What is it called?
Sanative. I couldn't tell you how to spell it, but I'm happy to send the link later. There's others like this, but
It
what
sounds like a medication.
well, it does, doesn't it? So it is a form of hygiene, I suppose, in one sense. So it's a tool developed specifically for artists, and what it does is embeds an invisible to a human watermark into your digital images, such that if if a generative model incorporates it into
Steals
training
it.
data, the result is just garbage. So that was the thing the students had brought in. This particular student had said, well, this kind of excites me because I have friends who are musicians or artists and visual artists, and I want them still to be able to not starve, and I want, and more to the point, if their output is going to be hoovered up and become part of somebody else's training set, I want them to I want them to know that ahead of time and to be able to say that they approve of that.
Which isn't happening now.
No. I had the opportunity last week to talk to Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI, and
Ooh, where?
this was part of a group that I was
That's so cool.
part of, and I mean it wasn't anything to do with me. I just kind of was tagging along, but in that conversation, this question came up about, you know, the FTC that I mentioned earlier has actually filed a suit against OpenAI because of this specific behavior, and he was pretty dismissive actually about their chances of prevailing in court. And other people I've talked to who are attorneys have also suggested, well, copyright doctrine is probably not going to protect a lot of the things that people wish could be protected in this case. So we're back to your question, which is how do you protect it? And I don't know whether on a large scale that's possible. So think back maybe to the days of Napster, where at a large scale,
They were
it wasn't
hoovering up
possible
music
to
and,
make the case just sort of in this huge way that, hey, people, stop ripping our music and not paying for it. What instead had to be done was a different kind of model of paying for it, but also a different way that some musicians were able to relate to their fans. And this didn't work for all musicians, right? A lot of them are still, piracy is
earning
still rampant,
pennies,
right? So it's not clear that as a community we can say anything about the future for visual artists or authors, right? But it may be that some niches or some specific people are able to have the kind of relationship that allows them to still survive or makes people less inclined to want to incorporate their stuff into a model in the first place.
I feel like I'm still kind of optimistic about high quality content. You know, and I mean, I know that the AI models for text and for images they're already way better than they used to be. They'll get better and better. But there's still, I heard an interview a few weeks ago with the head of programming for HBO, which is kind of like the highest quality TV content. And he was saying, and this was while I think the writer's strike had just wrapped and the actor's strike was still going on. He was just sort of saying, I can't imagine a world where I would be interested in an AI-generated script. And if you read anything, if you've played with ChatGPT, which I encourage you to do just because it's a fun exercise, like every time I've asked it to write anything, it's like, write a grant thing, write this, you know, your first reaction is like, wow, that's really good. And then you read it more carefully and you're like, wow, that's a string of cliches, which is what it's designed to do. It is a predictive engine that, you know, basically is predicting the next word in a sequence based on the data that it's fed, which is all of the goop on the internet, which is like sort of an average, you know, you're sort of averaging out the quality of human
except
output.
it can do things in a specific style.
You can
of a specific writer.
No, that is true. The prompting, you know, if you're good at prompting, or if you ask just the right question, you can get that. I mean, and I don't know. I guess I haven't done the taste test, right, where you really can like, is this Faulkner or is this Faulkner bot, you know? But I think in terms of sort of, I guess I have some optimism that original work will still be valued, at least on the highest level. I think the mid and lower level, maybe it's worrisome.
Let me get open to the students because we've got about 20 minutes left. Questions, thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
So, I think,
Can you speak up a bit?
yes, there have been plenty of, negative depictions of AI in media, both in news and movies and books. Every sort of media has had its own, like, this is a warning, don't do this. And we saw earlier in a graph that more people are now concerned about AI. And we all expect it to become more of a part of our everyday lives. How can we reconcile that and improve the perception of it while not, like, diminishing its impact?
It's pretty easy.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say something that is technical, and so I'll get way out over my skis, and then Professor Hicks can correct me. But what's interesting is that they've been doing these sort of large language model. They've been doing these models for a little while now, and it was never very good until it got very, very large. And essentially, what's underneath it is a bunch of like regression coefficients and multiplication just going on and on and on. And at a certain point, as it got larger and larger, it all of a sudden tipped over into something different, which is now what we see with ChatGPT. And I think, to get to your question, I think we just don't, I think the public doesn't understand what that threshold tipping point was. Like, how did we get from stuff that was like machine learning and was like kind of interesting, and you know, we had chatbots, you know, for quite a while now, but something happened with the size of these models that I think we're still all trying to grapple with. Is that human intelligence? Is it what happened there? This is kind of like Frankenstein moment almost. And so now having gotten way over my skis, like, and I just think not being able to understand what happened there is fueling lots of fears about the Terminator and about this and that, and but there was maybe like a Promethean moment almost that.
Well,
Yeah, here you go.
Can I add one quick thing
Yeah,
on that, just
yeah.
to sort of add to your point and to is that it's also designed. The interface is designed to make you think that there is an intelligence, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, even the term is kind of like a little bit deceptive, as you've said. But if you type something into ChatGPT, it sort of pretends it's typing in real time.
Yeah.
It's not. Like,
Right.
it knows its thing. It's like the language we use around it, the terms like hallucination, like the language that has formed around it. And I think, you know, that by design probably is meant to deceive us into thinking there's an intelligence when there actually isn't. So I think it's partly just being aware of the language we use and the you know, the tricks it does.
So what got me into philosophy actually was, way back when I was a teenager, was this sort of set of philosophical questions about, well, could there be artificial minds and all. So I'm not prepared to rule out the possibility that there could one day be artificial minds. I don't think these are they. I think part of what's happening is, and this happens in other areas, like when we try to think far ahead into the future, and this is relevant to climate change discussions, I think humans generally are just really, we're not good at thinking about really large quantities of things or things that are really distant from us in time. So what I think is really important to understand about a model like the GPT models is the trillions of bits of text that they've been trained on. We never will ever encounter in multiple lifetimes that we could live a small fraction of that much text. It's all of Reddit, right? It's a lot of social media conversations. It's a lot of news sites. Billions and billions of books and other things that are online. So anything that you type in, it has probably seen that exact sentence in its training data literally a billion times. So again, that's just hard for our little brains to grasp. And so it seems magical. It seems like the sort of precursors of intelligence or thought. It's not, right? It's just, it would be surprising if it didn't produce that kind of output. These are large language models, right? They're modeling language. So it would be as if you looked at a globe and you were like, ooh, isn't that weird that South America is right underneath North America? Well, no, it's a globe, right? It's modeling what the Earth looks like. So you would expect it, right, to be a good model of the Earth, just as you should expect these things to be good models of conversation, because they're trained on what is the next likely phrase based on the trillions of inputs that I've gotten based on scraping the internet, right? So it's modeling what it's like to have a conversation on the internet.
But how do we get from 2020 to 2023? Like, what? It does seem that there's a in almost all human minds an electric like reaction suddenly to what's going on that wasn't there before. Like, what was that turn? And like, where's the coefficient in that model that explains why suddenly we're all electrified by this?
Well, the T in GPT, which is the transformer aspect of the coding,
Yeah.
which was present in earlier models, but once you add a lot more parameters, right, a lot more
Yeah.
numerical values that can be stored, and so then again, it's not that we can't explain what happens. It's that it seems magical because, again, it's a quantity of information that we can't visibly understand that quantity of information. But your question, I think, was really about something like, how do we continue forward, but without being afraid? So I guess I want to ask the question of why we should be continuing forward. So here's what I mean. So again, I'm new to Northeastern. This is my second year here. One of the things that I've noticed is nothing can ever be smaller. Everything should always be bigger, right? There should always be more of things. scale, right? And that's also what you hear a lot in Silicon Valley, and just the idea that something that could serve a community of, say, 1 million people, that's terrible. It should be serving 100 million people, right? It's not enough for us to be in just one country as Facebook. We need to be in all the countries. And so I think you're buying a lot of problems when you don't slow down and really reflect and be deliberate and deliberative, right? And so I don't think that means we should be afraid of these technological systems, but I think it means we should learn a lot from our history and from our present and just be very deliberate about, well, why do we need this here? Or who needs it here? And for what purposes? And what if we didn't? Or what if we did it more slowly? Or what if we did it at a smaller scale? What might happen in any of those cases? So I think that you're right that a lot of the media portrayals of AI almost always involve some villain who, again, is trying to move at super speed for profit or world domination. And what we don't have is a lot of alternative visions in the media of what would it be like to associate AI with joy instead of with dread or with a sense of inevitability or a sense of confusion, right? We don't have a lot of people telling those kinds of story right now. Yep.
I know you guys were talking a little bit earlier about like the inaccuracies involved with ChatGPT or just AI in general as of right now. This is more of like a prediction and like what you guys think based on your knowledge on AI. Do you think that it's going to be a long time before you're able to resolve some of those inaccuracies that are involved with like disinformation or misinterpretation of certain sources or articles or so forth? I mean, because that is a big thing to consider using the actual platforms and software, because I mean, if it's going to misinform you on an article that you have from 10 years ago, it's like, why would I want to use that? But is there any predictions of what needs to be done in order for that to be fixed? Is it just, again, like the content moderation, like more of that, or is it like other processes that need to be involved? But it's really more, it depends on your knowledge. I know it might be like very broad, but I don't know, I feel like in the actual lab, is there something that might be able to be used to maybe like counteract that? Or
Joanna, you want to take a swing?
Oh gosh. No, I mean, I think again there are two pieces to it. There's like the regulatory side, where, as John was saying, you kind of you demand more content moderation, and then there's the consumer side, where you understand the risks of anything that you see, and you look at everything with the awareness that it could be real or it could be not. Again, who you're trusting to determine what's real is that's the problem that we're in as a society, is that we're trusting different sources, and we're generally not trusting not that the old model of the one source was perfect, but at least you had some sort of like accepted standard for truth telling that we increasingly lack. But my personal feeling is that with a lot of stuff, there's really, because there's no choice, it has to rest with the consumer. You're not going to be able to put the toothpaste back in the tube. You're going to have to accept that this is out there to some degree. So you have to be a smart and savvy consumer of it, which means understanding on some level, on some basic level, how it works, why it's presenting what it is, what's the risk of what you're presenting, and just, kind of, in the same way that it's like, and it's hard because it's like let's say I were a human just sort of like Googling vaccines. I could find, good information about vaccines. I could find bad information, but the bad information looks like good information because the people making the bad information know how to make it look like good information. So you have to be savvy on like multiple levels, but I think it's going to be on us.
So this kind of falls into what you were saying earlier about like what if you reframed how we viewed AI? And so one of the issues we've brought up a couple times is like jobs being taken by AI. I kind of want to just ask like if you guys have heard anything in the conversation about kind of flipping that narrative and how AI handling those more, not basic level jobs, but those jobs that AI can't handle. What if that opens up doors to a more innovative society, a more cohesive, a more friendly society? And have you guys heard any conversation on that, or do you have any personal hopes about that?
McDonald's machine.
That's definitely the argument. That's an argument that's out there for sure.
In terms of like the labor replacement area, one of the things that's interesting is that traditionally technology has replaced sort of lower skilled work. Right now, it seems poised to replace sort of middle white collar work, right? So, I mean, I know lots of attorneys who are looking at
accountants
too.
too.
What these models can do, and it's like they could do everything I do or at least a lower level, a junior associate maybe at a law firm in a day. They could just do it all in a few minutes, with some finesse. So I think, suddenly people who do things like plumbing and builders and whatnot, like they're actually probably safe for quite some time until the robotics can kind of get to that level. But I think the big worry is that just the speed with which this seems poised to happen will not give us enough time to do retraining and reskilling and upskilling and all of that. And but the point about joy is a great one. I'm trying to figure out how to respond to it, but maybe I'll take a minute. I don't know if either of you two want to.
Well, actually, so I brought this up because this came across the transom, as we used to say in the 1940s, the other day when Microsoft Research is a kind of research arm, our lab. They're actually they put out a call for fellowships about this specific topic, like AI and joy. So they want researchers and people to help them kind of imagine new narratives and just think about what that would be like to associate that. So when in my courses I talk about the kind of question that you're bringing up, I always start by talking about technologies are not autonomous, right? When people talk about computers or whatever putting people out of jobs, they're being dishonest. What they mean is a human deciding to use those technologies to put other humans out of a job, right? So there's nothing inevitable about any of this. It's all very evitable, right? We could make different decisions about what kind of work gets done by machines completely, what kind is supplemented or used as a supplement for human labor. We also need to think about the difference between jobs and tasks, right? So it may not be that certain jobs go away, but that maybe certain tasks that make up those jobs get reconfigured or transformed in particular ways. So I think there are a lot of subtleties to the conversation, and there's also, it's important as well to think about the history of promises about who will benefit from the promise of automation and who gets to share in the gains from these promised benefits. The story always ends the same way, right? And so could this be a time when there's a maybe different ending in the story? I don't know. But again, we have to go back to the point that this is not inevitable, right? We do have the time to actually think about this and the kind of world we want to see. And we also, I think, like we in this room and on the call or whatever, sometimes we describe other people's work as dull or as low skill. That may not be how they experience it, right? And that also needs to be everyone needs to be part of the conversation who does work, right? Especially if we're talking about some people losing work. We need to know what work looks like from the point of view of the people doing it and not just the point of view of the rest of us kind of looking at those people. Because a lot of people think what we do is pretty useless too, right? And
Increasingly.
maybe are happy that
Yeah.
So I don't know that that's an answer to your question, but I'm just pointing out the kinds of things that I want my students to be thinking about.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, yeah. Computer science student.
Oh,
I found that comment about invisible watermarks interesting.
Could you speak up?
Yeah, I thought the invisible watermark concept was interesting, but how do we differentiate between human created content and AI generated content? I know the current system is copyright, and that can't even protect from pirated content, much less AI. So, what are some of the solutions that are being proposed for that?
From what I gather, and I'm not a lawyer, but from what I know and have read and have heard, it's very difficult. That it seems unlikely that AI generated content is copyrightable. There's just there's so much, on one level, multiple people can put in the same prompt. Give me a picture of a dog wearing a cowboy hat, and that's so you can't own that. Even if you put in a very specific prompt, like a 1,000-word prompt about, the dog in the style of Picasso wearing a hat with that's orange with yellow feathers, there's still sort of variability in the output such that the person putting in the prompt can't really say that they were the provenance of the art. So if that's what you're talking about, I'm not sure, it's a little bit of like a free-for-all legally in the art world, but I'm not sure that something that you generate as an AI tool under this legal framework that we currently have would be copyrightable. Now, your own work, that's like a big challenge as well under current
But
copyright law.
the controversy right now
Yeah.
is that what goes in may be copyrightable
Mhm.
work,
Mhm.
but as it's synthesized with other copyrightable work, what comes out isn't original or copyrightable.
Right.
Right. That's why we can have Google Books, right? That the judge in that case ruled that although Google had scraped the web and found all these books without the permission of all the copyright holders, the judge ruled that the new use was sufficiently transformative, right? That it met this threshold of not just being a copy, right? That it was genuinely transformative. And so if OpenAI and all these other folks can make a similar kind of case to an equally sympathetic judge, right? Then that's where we'll be.
Well, this is great. I mean, I want to thank you for coming. I think we're all going to enroll in Professor Ricks's course.
Okay, well, you're welcome.
But
There's
thank you
always
very
room
much.
for more. Yeah.
Thank you.